Jesus' closing line in Matthew chapter 5 is, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." And that seems like a tall order to live out, which is why I think some people theologically use this verse as a reason to throw out the rest of Matthew chapter 5 as practical life advice. And other people see it and they just say, okay, and this is what's wrong with the religion. That's way too hard. No one can be perfect. And then they just give up. But I would say if you take Jesus seriously by understanding some vocabulary, some context, and understanding his images that he uses in this passage, then this is a text that you can actually live out and strive for, as crazy as it sounds, to try to be perfect. Now, let's look at what he says in the text itself. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. If you've been following along in the Matthew chapter 5 Sermon on the Mount series, you'll know that each of these segments, these last few times, have started with, you've heard it said, or it was told to the people long ago, or it is written, but I say this thing. Now, in this text, the first contextual clue to what Jesus is trying to do here is he says, you've heard it said, love your friends and hate your enemies. Up until this point, every single time he says something like that, it's a quote from the Old Testament that he is now reinterpreting. This one's different. It does not say anywhere in the Old Testament, does not say anywhere in the Hebrew Scriptures, love your friends, hate your enemies. But apparently in Jesus' day, this is a thing that people say. And probably in our day, I mean, this is still relatable, right? That's the advice you get is be nice to the people who are nice to you and, shove off the haters. Who cares about what the haters think? And so, first of all, that's a contextual clue here, is that Jesus is not directly engaging with an Old Testament passage, but he is actually engaging with something that people say in society, and he's correcting that perspective on reality, the conventional wisdom about who you ought to be nice to and who you ought to be mean to. Now, I think part of the most crucial piece of the clue is in understanding the Greek word. Now, I think sometimes people unpack Greek words and unnecessarily unpack the Greek word just because it makes you sound smart. But I think in this context, understanding what the word perfect means is going to be really crucial to us. And the word perfect here, when he says, y'all be perfect, he uses the plural form of the word teleios. Teleios, or its plural teleioi, means perfect, yes, in some cases, but in a lot of cases, in fact, the majority of the cases, it's the type of perfection that is referred to when something is brought to its end, to its completion, something that is fully mature. So for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, Paul does his long rant on love, and he says, but where there's prophecies, they'll cease, where there's tongues, they'll be stilled, where there's knowledge, it'll pass away, for we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. Some translations even render it as when perfection comes, what is in part disappears. And Paul, in that text, he's referring to when Jesus wraps this whole picture up, the universe, this whole history of humanity, when that all gets wrapped up and completed, when it's brought to its completion, then those other things will pass away, but love won't, etc., etc. Or in James 1:4, James is giving a list of why you should rejoice when you face persecution. Because when you face persecution, it develops certain character traits, and that last character trait he lists is perseverance or endurance or patience, depending on the translation. But he says, and that patience must have its teleios, so that you may be teleios, so that you may be perfect. In that text, though, most translators render it as mature, right? That endurance or perseverance should reach its logical complete end so that you can be mature. Right? He says mature and complete. There's another Greek word that they can use for completion. And so in the text, most people render it as maturity, that you've grown up. There are other places in the New Testament where it simply is just referring to someone who has reached adulthood. That is someone who has reached their teleios. And so when Jesus says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, He's inviting us into a process that has a logical end in maturity, in completeness. And if you want to have the picture for what a complete follower of Jesus looks like, for what a complete son of the Father looks like, he gives examples from nature. Remember, Jesus is preaching outside. So in his sermon, there are several points where you'll see that he actually pulls from things that probably is looking at right there. And he says, hey, you want to know what it looks like to be complete and mature and whole and perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect? Well, he sends rain on both the good and the evil. When it rains, he doesn't make it rain on some people's fields and not rain on other people's fields. It just rains for everybody. If you're good or you're evil, it rains on everybody. And his practical advice for those of us who are followers of Jesus is obviously we can't control the rain, but he's like, hey, you can control who you pray for. In all of Jesus's teaching, he tells us to pray, but only on this one occasion does he tell us to pray for someone. And when he tells us to pray for someone, the one person he tells us to pray for are our enemies. You're probably going to pray for your family and your kids and your friends and your beloved people. You're going to pray for the people that you like in society, but your default heart position probably is not to pray for the people that you don't like a whole lot, to pray for your enemies. Now, notice that he doesn't say you can't have enemies, right? If someone wants to still be your enemy, they can be your enemy. But if they want to be your enemy, it doesn't affect the fact that you pray for them and you love them. See, Jesus' analogy of the rain falling on the good and the evil, he then unpacks what this looks like in most human interactions. He's like, hey, don't terrible people still treat people that they like nicely? Right? Everybody has a nice side for the people that they like, right? The most horrendous, evil, wicked person you can think of in history probably still had nice moments where they bought flowers for someone that they cared about or said a nice word to someone that they thought was worthy of a nice word. No matter how bad a person is, if they're a pagan or even a tax collector, which is ironic, by the way, like little note here is that if Matthew was a tax collector and he's the author of this, he's got to be smiling to himself as he writes these words of Jesus, that you're just like a tax collector. You're just like a pagan if you're only nice to the people who are nice to you. What's so special about you? Are you really a special child of the Father who sends rain on everybody? And so the practical living of this out is helpful, but what does this say about our hearts? Because remember, each of these things talks about how there's this external command, but then an internal condition of the heart that needs to be addressed. And this one's a little bit tricky because it seems like, wait, love and hate, those both seem pretty internal to me. But think about what Jesus is saying. If you do the old way of things, love your friends, hate your enemies, who really gets to decide who you love? You might think that you are in charge of who you love or who you don't love. But if you're just loving your friends and hating your enemies, what that means is that the people that you love are only loved because they love you. The people that you like are only liked because they like you. They're your friends. They're not your enemies. See, what that means is that your love is determined externally. They get to decide whether or not you love them. Well, if they want to be your enemy, well, I guess you don't love them. If they don't want to be your friend, you don't have to love them. But Jesus says, hey, when you love your enemies, what this does is it raises the bar and says, hey, if you are internally a loving person, if you are a loving person, it doesn't matter if they're your enemy. You're going to love them because you're a loving person. If they love you, well, of course, you're still going to love your friends because you're a loving person. You're going to love your parents. You're going to love your nemesis at work. You're going to love that person that got the promotion over you. You're going to love all types of people if you're actually a loving person. And this is what it means to be teleios, this confounding, confusing phrase that Jesus refers to about being perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. He's saying, hey, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Be loving as your heavenly Father is loving. Actually loving, not just conditionally loving based on how people treat you, but actually loving. The same type of love that Jesus, the Son, lives out through the rest of his life and eventually on the cross. He is perfect as his heavenly Father is perfect. Right? He is whole and complete. He's a complete picture of what it looks like to be a child of the Father because he lays down his life. He sacrifices himself. He loves people who are even his enemies. On the cross, he says things like, Father, forgive them for they don't know what they're doing. and he still goes to the cross because he's a loving person and because he's a loving God. And the trip about Jesus is that he doesn't just say, this is where theologically I think people say, okay, so Jesus takes our place, so he's perfect, and therefore we don't have to then strive for the same type of maturity or completion. We don't have to also be this thing because he already did it for us. And don't get me wrong, your salvation is not contingent on your performance. But if you are a follower of Jesus, and if you are a person who loves the Father and wants to model your life after what it looks like to be a godly person, you acknowledge the fact that what needs to happen is there needs to be an internal change of love for every type of person in the world. In 1 John, the disciple John, remembering obviously his time that he spent with Jesus, says, hey, let's love one another because God is love. So when we choose to love our enemies, we are becoming more and more mature and complete, like our Heavenly Father and like Jesus. When we choose to love people who are difficult to love, we are transforming our hearts. We're allowing Jesus to shape and transform our hearts so that we can be like our Heavenly Father, so that we can do like Jesus says and take up our own cross and follow him. See, if we actually live out the things that he teaches in Matthew chapter 5, we start to have a heart that gets renovated by his Spirit and by his power so that we actually look mature, complete, or as James says it, not lacking anything. Be perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect, or be mature, grow in maturity so that we can look more and more like our Father. If this series has been helpful to you, please subscribe. I'll continue working our way through the Sermon on the Mount. I love producing these videos for you. Thank you.